163 million people. Stop. Let that number breathe for a moment. 163 million human beings, mothers who hummed lullabies to sleeping children, fathers who cracked jokes at dinner tables, young men who had never kissed anyone, old women who had survived everything life threw at them, all of them erased. Not by plague, not by earthquake, not by the slow indifference of nature. By 15, human beings who were handed power and chose to use it as a weapon against the very people they ruled. 163 million. That is more than the entire current population of Russia. It is more than 5 times the population of Canada. It is more than twice the population of France, Germany, and the United Kingdom combined. And every single one of those deaths traces back, in one way or another, to a decision made by a man sitting in a palace, behind a desk, on a throne, or in a war room. This is not a list of history's most famous villains. This is not a collection of ghost stories designed to shock and vanish. This is a reckoning, a precise, documented, devastating accounting of what happens when absolute power meets absolute moral failure. What you are about to hear is not comfortable. Some of these numbers are disputed by historians, debated in universities, contested in courtrooms. Where the numbers are uncertain, we will tell you. Where the numbers are terrifying, we will not soften them. Because here is the truth that history keeps whispering, and that we keep choosing not to hear. The most dangerous person in the world is not the criminal in the alley, it is the idealist in the palace. It is the man who believes so completely in his own vision, his own purity, his own destiny, his own version of a perfect world that he is willing to build it on a foundation of corpses. 15 men, hundreds of millions of lives, and a question that history has never fully answered. How did we let this happen? Again, and again, and again, this is the definitive count. These are the numbers, and they are terrifying. Before we begin counting the dead, we need to talk about how we count them. Because here is something that most documentaries, most lists, most rankings of history's worst tyrants quietly skip over. The numbers are almost always wrong. Not wrong in the sense of fabricated. Wrong in the sense that counting the dead under a dictatorship is one of the most difficult intellectual exercises in all of historical scholarship. Authoritarian regimes do not leave clean ledgers. They destroy records. They reclassify murders as natural deaths. They call engineered famines crop failures. They list political executions as suicide. They bury the evidence in mass graves that are not discovered for decades, sometimes centuries. So when we say that Mao Zedong killed between 45 and 75 million people, that range, that 30 million person gap, is not sloppy research. It is the honest acknowledgement that we are trying to reconstruct the truth from ashes. When we say that Stalin's regime caused the deaths of between 40 and 62 million people, the uncertainty is not ignorance. It is intellectual honesty about the limits of what we can know when the men responsible for the deaths were also responsible for keeping the records. With that caveat firmly in place, here is how we built this list. We rank these 15 figures primarily on the number of deaths attributable to their direct decisions or the direct policies of their regimes. We include deaths from political executions, deliberately engineered famines, forced labor, death marches, genocides, and wars of conquest that the ruler personally initiated. We do not, in most cases, include the full death toll of wars, in which they were a participant, but not the sole initiator, though we note these where relevant. We acknowledge that some of these figures were also brilliant military strategists, revolutionary intellectuals, or transformative statesmen. We note that too. Greatness and monstrousness are not mutually exclusive. In fact, the most terrifying discovery of this entire exercise is how often they come packaged together. We also need to establish something else before we begin. A word about time. 3 of the 15 men on this list, Mao Zedong, Joseph Stalin, and Adolf Hitler, were responsible for deaths in the 20th century. They operated within living memory. Their victims' grandchildren are still alive. The wounds they opened have not closed. The other 12 spanned 2,500 years of human civilization, from the Roman Emperor Nero in the 1st century of the Common Era to Pol Pot, whose regime ended in 1979. What links them across this vast stretch of time is not geography, ideology, or culture. What links them is structure. The concentration of unchecked power in the hands of a single individual, surrounded by people too afraid or too complicit to tell him no. Power, it turns out, does not corrupt in a simple, linear way. It does not slowly, steadily, gradually turn good people bad. It operates more like a drug, and like any drug, its effect depends enormously on the person taking it. Most people who are given significant power become cautious, even anxious. They feel the weight of responsibility. But a small percentage of people in history seems to have a terrible talent for elevating exactly these people to the highest positions, experience power as liberation, as permission, as the removal of the last external constraint on their will. And when those people gain absolute power over millions of lives, the results are what you are about to hear. There is one more thing we need to say about this list before we begin. Several of the men on it started with genuinely noble intentions. Lenin wanted to end the exploitation of the working class. Mao wanted to lift 400 million peasants out of medieval poverty. Pol Pot wanted to create a society free from inequality and foreign domination. Enver Pasha wanted to preserve a collapsing empire and protect a people who genuinely faced existential threats. These were not, in many cases, simple sadists who enjoyed killing for its own sake. They were, in a far more troubling way, true believers, men who had constructed elaborate ideological frameworks that justified any atrocity in service of a transcendent goal.
Spirit of progress.
This is what makes them so difficult to understand
this afternoon.
and so important to understand. The lesson of the worst tyrants in history is not that evil exists. Everyone already knows that. The lesson is that evil rarely announces itself as evil. It announces itself as salvation. It announces itself as a great cause, a historic mission, a final solution to an ancient problem. And by the time the people living under it realize what it actually is, the machinery of terror is already running at full capacity. Now we count the dead. We begin not with the worst, but with the 15th. A man from 2,000 years ago who reminds us that this story is older than we think, and a man from the east coast of Africa who reminds us that absolute power is not a Western pathology. We work our way upward, through escalating numbers, through escalating horror, until we reach the three men whose combined body count staggers the moral imagination. By the time this is over, you will understand why these numbers are not just statistics, they are arguments. Arguments about power, about ideology, about the specific ways that human institutions can fail. Arguments that are, if you pay close attention, still being made today. 15 men. Let us meet them. Number 15. Narrow Roman Empire. 5468 CE. The year is 64 CE. The city of Rome is burning. Flames have taken hold in the merchant district near the Circus Maximus, and they are moving fast, faster than anyone anticipated, feeding on the dried timber of a city that has grown too dense, too fast, too carelessly. For 6 days and 7 nights, the fire tears through the greatest city in the ancient world. 10 of Rome's 14 districts are damaged or destroyed. Hundreds of thousands of people are made homeless overnight. And somewhere in the hills above the burning city, according to ancient sources, the Emperor Nero is playing his lyre. Whether that image is literally true is a matter of scholarly dispute. What is not in dispute is what happened next. Nero blamed the Christians. He accused this small, politically powerless religious minority of setting the fire, and he used that accusation to authorize one of the earliest systematic persecutions of a religious group in Western history. Christians were burned alive. They were crucified. They were fed to animals in public spectacles, designed to entertain the Roman crowd, while simultaneously communicating a message of absolute imperial power. Dissent will be destroyed. Difference will be punished. Before the fire, Nero had already demonstrated a particular talent for eliminating people who inconvenienced him. He had his own mother, Agrippina, murdered in 59 CE, a killing so brazen, so stripped of even the pretense of justification, that it shocked even the Roman Senate, a body not easily shocked by political violence. He killed his first wife, Octavia. He killed philosophers, generals, and senators who displeased him. He used treason trials the way a modern criminal might use a weapon, as a tool for eliminating enemies while maintaining the appearance of legal process. Nero's total death count is difficult to quantify. The Roman Empire had no central registry of political executions. But what his reign established the template of an emperor who used state power to murder political enemies, religious minorities, and inconvenient family members echoed through the centuries that followed. He killed himself in 68 CE, reportedly weeping the words, "What an artist dies in me." Even at the end, his primary concern was his own image. This too became a template. Number 14. Idi Amin Dada, Uganda, 1970, 1979. In 1971, Idi Amin seized power in Uganda in a military coup while the country's elected president was abroad. Within 8 years, his government had killed somewhere between 100,000 and 500,000 of his own citizens. The uncertainty in that range, a 400,000-person gap, tells you everything you need to know about how he governed. Amin was not subtle. He was not ideological in any coherent sense. He did not have a theory of history or a vision of the future. What he had was an almost pure expression of personal power, the ability to kill anyone who annoyed him, threatened him, or simply caught his attention on the wrong day. He expelled Uganda's entire Asian community, some 60,000 people, in 1972, seizing their businesses and homes and handing them to political allies. The economic collapse that followed was swift and catastrophic, but Amin didn't care. Economic logic was not a constraint on him because nothing was a constraint on him. His victims included his own cabinet ministers, Supreme Court justices, foreign diplomats, and the Anglican Archbishop of Uganda. He is widely reported to have engaged in cannibalism, though the evidence for this remains contested. What is not contested is that his secret police, the State Research Bureau, maintained torture chambers in the basement of a Kampala building where bodies were disposed of in the Nile River. But here is what makes Amin particularly instructive. The international community knew, Western governments knew. They continued to engage with his regime, to trade with it, to tolerate it, because Uganda was strategically located and Amin was, for a while, entertaining a buffoon, they called him. A cartoon villain too theatrical to be taken entirely seriously. The Butcher of Uganda, his people called him. The international press called him colorful. 300,000 people died while the world chose the more comfortable word. He died in Saudi exile in 2003, comfortable and unindicted, an old man in a warm country, unpunished by any court in the world. Number 13. Enver Pasha, Ottoman Empire, 1913. 1918. There is a word for what Enver Pasha did to the Armenian people. The word is genocide, and for over a century, the government of Turkey has refused to use it. Enver Pasha was one of 3 military officers, the 3 Pashas who effectively controlled the Ottoman Empire during the First World War. He was brilliant, ambitious, and absolutely convinced of the superiority of the Turkish people, whom he believed were being encircled and destroyed by Christian minorities within the empire and Christian powers without. In April of 1915, he and his co-conspirators issued orders that began the systematic deportation and mass murder of the Armenian population of Anatolia. What followed was one of the first organized genocides of the modern era. Armenians were rounded up, marched into the Syrian desert, and killed by shooting, by starvation, by exposure, by deliberate massacre. Between 1.1 and 1.5 million Armenians died. The Greek and Assyrian communities of Anatolia suffered similar fates, bringing the total death toll of ethnic cleansing under the 3 Pashas to somewhere between 1.5 and 2.5 million people. Enver Pasha fled the collapsing Ottoman Empire after the First World War. He attempted to organize a pan-Turkic resistance movement in Central Asia, fighting against Soviet forces. He was killed in 1,922 inches, a cavalry charge, sword in hand, trying to the last to build the empire he had dreamed of on the bones of the people he had destroyed. His body was eventually repatriated to Turkey in 1996, where he was buried with full military honors. Number 12. Kim Il-sung, North Korea, 1948. 1994. Kim Il-sung invented something new in the history of tyranny, the hereditary totalitarian state. Other dictators have tried to pass power to their children. None succeeded in building a dynasty that has now lasted 3 generations and counting. He ruled North Korea from its foundation in 1948 until his death in 1994, 46 years of absolute control over a country he treated as his private property. During the Korean War, which he initiated by invading South Korea in June 1950, approximately 3 million people died. His prison camp system, the Kwanliso, held hundreds of thousands of political prisoners under conditions of systematic starvation, torture, and forced labor. Estimates of deaths in the camps range from 400,000 to over 1 million. The total death toll attributable to his regime, including the Korean War, hovers around 1.6 million people. But the number alone does not capture the particular horror of Kim's North Korea, which was something qualitatively different from other dictatorships. It was a nation redesigned from the ground up as a system of total psychological control. Kim did not merely want his people obedient. He wanted them to love him. He built a cult of personality so pervasive, so thoroughly interwoven into the fabric of daily life, that many North Koreans genuinely believed, and many of their descendants still believe, that he was a god. Not a godlike figure, an actual divine being. A man who reportedly did not need to defecate, who was born on a sacred mountain in a flash of light, who had an almost supernatural ability to know when he was being betrayed. He taught his people that the outside world was a hellscape of poverty and violence, and that North Korea was a paradise. He built walls tall enough that most people could never check. He died in 1994. His son inherited the country, his grandson rules it today. Number 11. Hideki Tojo, Imperial Japan. 1944. 1944. On the 7th of December, 1941, Japanese aircraft attacked the United States naval base at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. It was an act of extraordinary strategic audacity and extraordinary strategic foolishness, a blow powerful enough to shock, but not powerful enough to destroy, the industrial giant it had chosen to awaken. The man who authorized it was General Hideki Tojo, who had become Prime Minister of Japan just 2 months earlier. Tojo was not the architect of Japanese imperial expansionism. That project had been underway for decades before he took power. But he was its most aggressive executor. And under his leadership, Japan's military campaign in Asia reached a scale of brutality that still reverberates in the relationship between Japan and its neighbors. The rape of Nanking occurred in 1937, before Tojo's prime ministership. But the culture of military impunity that produced it was one he had helped build and that he did nothing to restrain. During the years of his effective command, approximately 4 million people died as a direct consequence of Japanese military policy in Asia, through combat, through deliberate massacres, through forced labor, through the calculated starvation of civilian populations in occupied territories. Unit 731. The Covert Biological and Chemical Warfare Research Unit that conducted experiments on living human beings, operated under the military command structure that Tojo oversaw. He was arrested after the war, tried by the International Military Tribunal for the Far East, convicted of war crimes, and hanged in December 1948. He was the only figure on this list of 15 to face formal international legal accountability for his crimes. That fact says something both about Tojo and about the rarity of justice in the wake of mass atrocity. Number 10. Vladimir Ilich Lenin, Soviet Russia, 1917-1924. Before Stalin, there was Lenin. And without Lenin, there would have been no Stalin. This is not a comfortable thing to say, because Lenin occupies a peculiar place in the historical imagination. He is the intellectual, the man who synthesized Marxist theory into a workable revolutionary program, who led the October Revolution of 1917 against genuinely impossible odds, who created the first workers' state in history. In the mythology of the left, he is the icon. The thinker, the revolutionary who actually succeeded where 100 others had failed. He was also the man who invented the Red Terror. In 1918, following an assassination attempt that left him seriously wounded, Lenin authorized a campaign of mass political violence against anyone deemed an enemy of the revolution. The Cheka, the secret police he had created, carried out executions by the tens of thousands. Entire social classes were declared enemies of the state and subjected to systematic violence. Peasants who resisted the forcible seizure of their grain were shot. Members of the aristocracy, the clergy, and the bourgeoisie were imprisoned, exiled, or killed. The gulags that would define Stalin's Russia had their origins in Lenin's Russia. The architecture of totalitarian terror, the secret police, the labor camps, the systematic use of famine as a political weapon, the criminalizing of political dissent was built by Lenin and merely expanded catastrophically by his successor. Lenin's total death toll, including deaths from the Civil War, famine, and Red Terror, is estimated at approximately 4 million people. He died in 1924 of a stroke, before he could see the full consequences of the machinery he had built. Or perhaps more accurately, before he could be held accountable for them. Number 9. Chiang Kai-shek, Republic of China and Taiwan. 1926. 1975. Chiang Kai-shek is one of history's most successfully rehabilitated tyrants, a man whose brutality was largely whitewashed in the West because he was fighting communism, and the West needed him to be a hero. He was not a hero. During the decades of his rule over mainland China and later Taiwan, Chiang's regime was responsible for the deaths of approximately 6 million people through political executions, military campaigns against civilian populations, and the brutal suppression of labor movements, political opposition, and ethnic minorities. The White Terror, his campaign of political repression in Taiwan beginning in 1947, killed somewhere between 10,000 and 30,000 people and imprisoned tens of thousands more. In February 1947, following protests in Taipei that grew out of a confrontation between government agents and a civilian woman, Chiang's military carried out a massacre that Taiwanese people still call the 228 incident. The number killed is disputed. Estimates range from 10,000 to 30,000, but the pattern of violence was consistent. Intellectuals, community leaders, lawyers, doctors, anyone who might be capable of organizing resistance, rounded up and shot. Chiang died in 1975. In Taiwan, for decades, it was illegal to discuss the 228 incident publicly. His portrait hung in government buildings, his statues dotted public squares. The rehabilitation of monsters, it turns out, requires only the right enemies. Transition. The tier above. We have covered 9 of the 15. The deaths attributable to these 9 men added together, correcting for the uncertainty in the figures, total somewhere between 14 and 22 million people. And we have not yet reached the top 6. What follows are men whose individual body counts dwarf the combined totals of everyone we have named so far. What follows are the people for whom the word atrocity is genuinely insufficient, for whom historians have had to reach for words like democide and mass murder and genocide, and, in the cases of the top 3, for a category of crimes so large that our moral vocabulary simply breaks down. Brace yourself. The numbers get worse from here. Number 8. Pol Pot, Democratic Kampuchea, 1975. 1979. The 17th of April 1975. Phnom Penh, Cambodia. The city is celebrating. After years of civil war, after American bombing campaigns that killed tens of thousands of civilians and destabilized the government, after the brutal chaos of a conflict that neither the Cambodian people started nor the Cambodian people wanted, the Khmer Rouge have arrived. Young soldiers in black pajamas and red scarves march through the capital's streets, and the exhausted residents come out to watch them, some waving, some hoping that the war is finally over, that the killing will stop, that something, anything, resembling normalcy will return to a country that has been bleeding for 5 years. They did not know what was coming. How could they? The order came within hours of the city's capture. Evacuate Phnom Penh. Immediately. Everyone. The hospitals emptied patients on drips, patients fresh out of surgery, patients who had not walked in months, pushed out of their beds and into the street. The population of the capital, somewhere between 2 and 3 million people, began moving out of the city in massive columns, forced at gunpoint into the countryside by soldiers, most of whom were teenagers, armed with rifles and an ideology so simple, so pure, so completely divorced from the reality of human life that it functioned less like a political program and more like a death sentence. The ideology was this. Year 0. Pol Pot, born Saloth Sar, educated in France on a scholarship, radicalized in Paris by a particular strain of Maoist thought that he took to its absolute logical conclusion, had decided that Cambodia needed to be remade from the beginning, not reformed, not improved. Remade. The cities would be emptied, money would be abolished, religion would be abolished, schools would be closed, books would be burned. Glasses would be forbidden because glasses meant you could read, and reading meant you had been educated under the old corrupt system, and that made you an enemy. Family bonds would be severed. Children would be separated from their parents and raised as soldiers of the revolution. The calendar would be reset to year 1. And anyone who resisted or was suspected of resistance or was suspected of having once been part of the system that was being destroyed would be taken to one of the hundreds of interrogation centers that the Khmer Rouge established across the country. The most famous of these was S-21 in Phnom Penh, where approximately 14,000 people were tortured and killed between 1975 and 1979. 12 people are known to have survived. But S-21 was not where most people died. Most people died in the fields. They died of forced labor under starvation conditions, working rice paddies from before dawn to after dark while being fed a diet insufficient to sustain a child, let alone an adult performing heavy agricultural work. They died of malaria and dysentery and cholera, diseases that a functional medical system could have treated, but that the Khmer Rouge, having emptied the hospitals and killed the doctors, could not. They died in mass executions, taken to the edges of pits, beaten to death with iron bars to save bullets, their bodies tumbling into the earth below. The Cambodians called these places the killing fields. Today they are tourist attractions. Towers of skulls stand behind glass cases. Visitors photograph them and move on. In 4 years, Pol Pot's regime killed between 1.7 and 2.5 million people. That is somewhere between 20 and 25% of Cambodia's entire population. 1 in 4 Cambodians. Dead. In 4 years, there is no ideological justification. There is no historical context that makes this proportionally comprehensible. 1 in 4. But here is the detail that haunts every student of this period. Pol Pot was not a monster in appearance. He was mild, soft-spoken, reportedly charming. Journalists who met him described him as gentle. He smiled often. He gave speeches about the beauty of the new Cambodia he was building, about the equality and purity of the life he was creating for his people. He called himself Brother Number 1. He told the Cambodian people that they were building paradise. He died in 1998 of heart failure, under house arrest, not in a courtroom, not on a gallows, but in a small house in the jungle, surrounded by a handful of loyalists, in his bed. Number 7. Saddam Hussein, Iraq. 1969, 2003. In March of 1988, Iraqi Air Force planes flew over the Kurdish town of Halabja in northern Iraq and dropped bombs. But these were not conventional bombs. The explosions that followed produced a cloud of mustard gas, nerve agents, and possibly cyanide compounds that settled over the town's 40,000 residents like an invisible fog. Within minutes, people were dying in the streets. Within hours, approximately 5,000 people were dead. Thousands more suffered permanent injuries, blindness, chronic respiratory disease, cancers that would not manifest for years. The survivors described a smell like sweet apples. They described seeing people fall down mid-stride, not understanding what was happening to them. They described the bodies of children in the street. Saddam Hussein ordered the Halabja attack as part of a broader campaign he called the Anfal, an Arabic word meaning spoils of war, taken from the Quran. The campaign was explicitly designed to destroy the Kurdish population of northern Iraq as a political and cultural entity. Villages were bulldozed, families were separated, men of fighting age were executed en masse. Women and children were transported to detention facilities. Kurdish culture, language, and political organization were systematically suppressed. The Anfal campaign killed approximately 100,000 Kurds. The Halabja attack alone remains the largest chemical weapons attack against a civilian population in history. But the Anfal was not the beginning of Saddam's mass killing. It was one chapter in a story of violence that stretched back to 1979, when he consolidated power by summoning the full membership of the Ba'ath Party leadership to a hall in Baghdad, reading out the names of conspirators in a fabricated plot, and watching as they were led out of the room and shot. He remained in his seat, smoking a cigar, personally reading the names, tears reportedly running down his face as he condemned his oldest friends and colleagues to death. Over the following 3 decades, his regime killed approximately 2 million people through political executions, through the crushing of the Shia uprising in 1991, through the Iran-Iraq war which he initiated, through the invasion of Kuwait, and through the sustained campaign of terror against any population he perceived as disloyal. He was captured hiding in a hole in the ground near his hometown of Tikrit in December 2003. He was tried by an Iraqi tribunal, convicted of crimes against humanity, and hanged on the 30th of December 2006. He went to the gallows defiantly, refusing the hood that was offered to him, exchanging insults with his executioners until the trapdoor opened. He was, as with so many on this list, not a simple man. He was a complex one, cruel and capable, monstrous and, in the eyes of some of his people, genuinely heroic. This is what makes him so much harder to process than a simple villain. Simple villains are easy to condemn, complex ones are easy to ignore. Number 6. Tamerlane Timurid Empire. 1370. 1405. 700 years before Pol Pot, before Stalin, before Hitler, there was a man from the steppes of Central Asia who killed with a thoroughness and on a scale that the 20th century would struggle to match in percentage terms. His name was Timur. History knows him as Tamerlane, and he killed by the most conservative estimates somewhere between 15 and 17 million people, in an age when the world's total population was approximately 350 million. He killed, in other words, approximately 5% of every human being alive on Earth during his lifetime. Let that proportion land. Tamerlane was born in 1336 near the city of Samarkand, in what is now Uzbekistan. He was lame from a wound suffered in battle. His name comes from the Persian Timur-Ileng, meaning Timur the Lame, and he built an empire that stretched from Russia to India to Turkey to the Persian Gulf, through a combination of extraordinary military genius and extraordinary brutality. These two qualities were not in tension for Tamerlane. They were the same quality. His army moved like a force of nature, fast, disciplined, and ferocious. But what distinguished Tamerlane from other great conquerors was not simply that he killed. It was the deliberateness of the killing, the architecture of terror, the careful, considered construction of massacres designed not just to eliminate resistance, but to stamp it out of future generations. At Isfahan, he ordered the construction of a tower using the skulls of approximately 70,000 slaughtered residents. At Baghdad, which had already been devastated once by the Mongols a century earlier, he killed approximately 90,000 people. At Delhi, he arrived to find a city of over 1 million people. He left it almost empty, his army having killed so many of the city's inhabitants that the survivors reportedly abandoned the city entirely, leaving behind a capital that would take a century to repopulate. In Sivas, he offered the garrison terms of surrender. He would not spill their blood. They accepted. He had them buried alive. No blood was spilled. He told his commanders, later, that he had kept his promise. There is no moral framework, no political ideology, no historical grievance that explains the scale of what Tamerlane did. He was, in some important sense, simply a man for whom killing was not a regrettable necessity but a deliberate instrument, the primary tool in a political toolkit that sought to rule through terror so comprehensive that it functioned as a kind of permanent peace. His empire began collapsing almost immediately after his death in 1405, but the demographic consequences of his campaigns persisted for generations. Entire regions of Persia, Iraq, and India that had been centers of civilization simply ceased to function. Cities that had been among the most sophisticated in the world became ruins, the surviving populations too scattered and traumatized to rebuild. He is buried in a spectacular mausoleum in Samarkand, a building of extraordinary beauty, its walls lined with tiles of lapis lazuli blue. The incongruity is not accidental. Tamerlane was also a patron of arts and architecture, a man who plundered the craftsmen of every city he destroyed and brought them back to beautify his capital. He wanted the world to see what he built. He did not particularly mind if the world also saw what he burned. Number 5. King Leopold I, Belgium. Congo Free State, 1885, 1908. He never went there. This is perhaps the most extraordinary fact about Leopold II's rule over the Congo Free State. The Belgian king who enslaved approximately 10 million people in Central Africa, who mutilated hundreds of thousands of children, who built one of the most efficiently murderous colonial systems in the history of European imperialism, never once set foot in the country he claimed as his personal property. Leopold acquired the Congo, an area of approximately 2.25 million square kilometers, roughly the size of Western Europe, through a masterpiece of diplomatic manipulation. At the 1884 Berlin Conference, where the European powers carved up Africa among themselves with the clinical indifference of men dividing an inheritance, Leopold presented himself as a humanitarian. He was, he said, bringing Christianity and civilization to the darkness of Central Africa. He was ending the Arab slave trade. He was elevating a suffering people. The European powers believed him, or chose to believe him, or decided that believing him was more convenient than not believing him. What Leopold actually built in the Congo was a system of forced labor so extreme, so relentlessly calibrated to extract the maximum possible rubber and ivory from the maximum possible territory with the minimum possible cost, that it murdered the country's population through a combination of direct killing, starvation, disease, and the simple destruction of the social structures that had kept communities alive. The mechanism was this: rubber. Wild rubber was growing in the forests of the Congo, and at the end of the 19th century, with the explosion of the bicycle and the automobile, rubber was extraordinarily valuable. Leopold's agents established a system of quotas. Each village had to deliver a fixed amount of rubber each period, or face punishment. The punishment for falling short was a fine that no one could pay, or a burning of the village, or the kidnapping of women to be held hostage until the men returned with their quota. And to ensure that the guns issued to Leopold's soldiers and guards were being used productively rather than saved for hunting or trading, the agents required that soldiers account for every bullet fired by returning a severed human hand. They cut off hands. This was not a rumor, not a later exaggeration. It was policy. It was documented in missionary photographs, in official reports, in the testimonies of hundreds of witnesses. When bullets were wasted on animals or on target practice, soldiers would cut the hands from living people, sometimes children, to meet their quota. Baskets of severed hands were delivered to colonial offices as proof of the workforce's disciplinary efficiency. The total death toll from Leopold's Congo, through direct killing, starvation, disease, and the flight of entire populations into areas where they could not survive, is estimated at between 8 and 13 million people. Some historians put the number as high as 15 million. The population of the Congo was cut roughly in half during his 23 years of personal rule. Leopold died rich in 1909 in his palace in Belgium. He had used some of the money from the Congo to build public parks, grand boulevards, and museums for the Belgian people, who largely adored him. His statue still stands in several Belgian cities, though the pressure to remove them has intensified in recent years. The Congo paid for those parks with its children's hands. Number 4. Adolf Hitler, Nazi Germany, 1933, 1945. On the night of the 9th of November, 1938, across Germany and Austria, the sound of breaking glass filled the air. It began with shards. Shop windows in Jewish neighborhoods, shattered by organized squads of young men while police looked on. Then the fires started synagogues, hundreds of them, burning throughout the night, their flames visible for miles. 7,500 Jewish businesses were destroyed. About 30,000 Jewish men were arrested and taken to concentration camps. 91 people were killed in the violence itself, though the actual number was certainly higher. The Nazis called it Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass, a lyrical name for a pogrom, a poetic label for the moment when the German government publicly, visibly, unmistakably crossed the line from persecution to mob violence, and the world largely watched and did not act. Hitler had been in power for 5 years by the time of Kristallnacht. In those 5 years, he had already achieved things that a decade earlier would have seemed politically impossible. He had dismantled German democracy through entirely legal means, using the Reichstag fire as a pretext for emergency powers that were never revoked, and the Enabling Act as the instrument that transformed him from chancellor to dictator in all but name. He had remilitarized the Rhineland. He had absorbed Austria. He had taken the Sudetenland with the explicit encouragement of Britain and France, who desperately wanted to believe that each concession would be the last. But Kristallnacht was different. Kristallnacht was the state turning its apparatus against its own citizens, in the open, in the streets, in front of the world. And the world decided to keep appeasing. What followed, between 1939 and 1945, was the Holocaust, the systematic, industrialized murder of 6 million Jews, and the killing of approximately 5 million additional people deemed racially, politically, or otherwise undesirable: Roma, disabled people, gay men, Soviet prisoners of war, Polish civilians, and others. The scale of the bureaucratic organization required to kill 6 million people is almost incomprehensible. It required trains, administrators, engineers, accountants, chemists, architects, guards. It required the active participation or passive complicity of hundreds of thousands of ordinary Germans and the citizens of occupied countries. It required systems for identifying, registering, deporting, concentrating, and killing on an industrial scale. The extermination camps Auschwitz-Birkenau, Treblinka, Sobibor, Belzec, Chelmno, Majdanek were purpose-built facilities for the mass murder of human beings. Auschwitz alone, at its operational peak, was killing 10,000 people a day. 10,000 people a day. The total death toll of the Second World War, which Hitler initiated with the invasion of Poland on the 1st of September 1939, is approximately 70 to 85 million people. Of these, between 17 and 20 million are directly attributable to Nazi policy: the Holocaust, the deliberate starvation of Soviet prisoners, the mass shootings of civilian populations in Poland, the Soviet Union, Yugoslavia, and elsewhere. Hitler killed himself in his bunker in Berlin on the 30th of April 1945 as Soviet forces fought through the streets above him. He had been planning his suicide for days, testing cyanide on his dog. In his final political testament, dictated the night before his death, he blamed the Jews for everything: for the war, for Germany's defeat, for the suffering of the German people. He was consistent to the very end. Transition. 3. Remain. 4 men. 14 million dead between numbers 8 and 5. But what awaits at the top of this list is categorically different. What awaits at positions 3 through 1 is not merely a larger number. It is a different order of magnitude, a different scale of horror, a different kind of crime, crimes so large that they challenge the fundamental capacity of human empathy to process them. The next 3 names on this list killed between them more people than Hitler, Tamerlane, Leopold, Saddam, Pol Pot, Tojo, and Chiang combined. 3 men. More than 100 million deaths. Number 3. Joseph Stalin, Soviet Union, 1924, 1953. In 1932, the Soviet government confiscated the grain harvest of Ukraine. Not some of the harvest. All of it. The grain stores were emptied, the fields were stripped, and soldiers were stationed at the borders of Ukrainian villages to prevent the starving population from leaving in search of food. People ate bark, they ate grass, they ate leather, they ate the bodies of the dead. By the end of 1933, between 3 and 5 million Ukrainians had starved to death in a famine that was entirely man-made, entirely preventable, and entirely deliberate. Stalin knew. His regional officials sent him reports. He received the numbers. He did not redirect food to the famine zone. He increased the quotas. The Holodomor Ukrainian for death by hunger is one of the most documented and most disputed events of the 20th century. Disputed not because its facts are unclear, but because Russia, the successor state to the Soviet Union, has spent decades refusing to acknowledge that the famine was intentional, and the question of whether it constitutes a genocide under the legal definition remains actively contested. Ukraine, and the majority of Western historians, call it genocide. The international consensus is moving that direction. The Holodomor was not Stalin's only mass killing, not by a magnitude. Between 1936 and 1938, he conducted the Great Purge, a systematic campaign of political terror designed to eliminate every conceivable threat to his personal power. The purge consumed the Soviet military's entire senior leadership, 3 of 5 marshals, 13 of 15 army commanders, 50 of 57 corps commanders, crippling the Red Army in the years before Germany's invasion in 1941. It consumed the Communist Party's central leadership, filling the gulags and the execution cellars with the very people who had built the Soviet state. It consumed engineers, scientists, writers, musicians, anyone whose independent expertise gave them even a theoretical basis for questioning the judgment of the leader. The Gulag, the system of labor camps that stretched across the Soviet Union from Siberia to the Arctic, imprisoned somewhere between 15 and 18 million people during Stalin's rule. The death rate in the camps varied by year and by location, but the total number who died in the Gulag system is estimated at between 1.5 and 1.8 million. Add the Holodomor, the Great Purge, the Gulags, the deliberate starvation of Soviet citizens during the early collectivization campaigns, the deportation of entire ethnic populations, Chechens, Crimean Tatars, Volga Germans to Central Asian deserts, where hundreds of thousands died of exposure and starvation, and the total death toll attributable to Stalin's decisions reaches somewhere between 40 and 62 million people. He died in 1953. Possibly with the assistance of colleagues who feared what he was planning next, a new purge. The evidence suggests targeting the Soviet Union's Jewish population. He died in his dacha, on the floor, having apparently suffered a stroke and lain there for hours before his guards dared to enter his room without being summoned. The most powerful man in the Soviet Union was afraid to check on the dying man because the dying man, even dying, inspired more fear than death itself. Number 2. Mao Zedong, People's Republic of China, 1949, 1976. In 1958, Mao Zedong declared war on sparrows. The campaign to eliminate the Eurasian tree sparrow, which Mao identified as one of the 4 pests, alongside rats, flies, and mosquitoes, was part of the Great Leap Forward, his program to transform China from an agrarian society into a modern industrial and agricultural power within 5 years. The campaign against sparrows required all citizens to bang drums, shake trees, and make noise to prevent the birds from landing until they fell from the sky from exhaustion. By some estimates, approximately 1 billion sparrows were killed. The ecological consequence was immediate. Without sparrows to eat them, locust populations exploded, and the locusts destroyed crops across China at precisely the moment when crop yields were already being catastrophically misreported. Local officials, terrified of being accused of insufficient revolutionary enthusiasm, were reporting grain yields 2 and 3 times higher than actual production. The state was collecting grain based on the false reports. By the time Beijing understood what was actually happening, the famine had already begun. What followed between 1959 and 1961 was the deadliest famine in recorded human history. The most conservative estimates put the death toll at 30 million people. More recent demographic analyses suggest the true figure may have been between 45 and 55 million. Some researchers, incorporating evidence that was unavailable during the Cold War, suggest the number may be higher still. Mao knew the famine was happening. He knew because he was told, and he made a decision that defines his position on this list. He did not stop the grain exports. Throughout the famine, China continued exporting food to the Soviet Union and to other countries, partly to maintain diplomatic relationships and partly to demonstrate that the Great Leap Forward was succeeding. People were dying in the tens of millions. The grain continued to leave the country. The Cultural Revolution, which Mao launched in 1966, partly to reassert his political dominance after the catastrophe of the Great Leap Forward, added another estimated 1 to 2 million deaths through political violence, purges, and the destruction of social infrastructure. Teachers were killed by their students, parents were denounced by their children. The entire educated class of Chinese society was subjected to public humiliation, exile, imprisonment, and death. Total deaths under Mao's rule, somewhere between 45 and 75 million people. He died in September 1976 in Beijing at the age of 82. He had not been in good health for years. His final months were spent largely bedridden, unable to speak clearly, tended by nurses who had been selected for their political reliability rather than their medical expertise. In his last years, there are accounts of an old man who had watched his revolution turn into something he no longer fully controlled, who had lived long enough to see the Great Leap Forward become synonymous with catastrophe, who was still, even at the end, incapable of acknowledging what his decisions had cost. He is still, officially, a hero of the Chinese state. His portrait hangs over Tiananmen Square. His image appears on every denomination of the Chinese yuan. Number 1. The question. Here is the truth that this list cannot fully resolve. Between Mao Zedong and Joseph Stalin, historians genuinely disagree about who bears responsibility for more deaths. The ranges overlap. The methodologies differ. Stalin's regime operated for approximately 29 years. Mao's operated for 27. Stalin's killing was more deliberately targeted, specific classes, specific ethnicities, specific political enemies. Mao's killing was more diffuse, a catastrophic combination of ideological fantasy, administrative incompetence, and the refusal to acknowledge failure. If we rank purely by the upper bound of scholarly estimates, Stalin edges ahead. If we rank by the lower bounds, the two men are approximately equal. If we adjust for the percentage of the population, each man controlled a different kind of moral calculus. Pol Pot's Cambodia comes out worst, and Stalin and Mao are roughly equivalent. What is not in dispute is this. These two men, between them, were responsible for somewhere between 85 and 137 million deaths. The most violent century in human history was made more violent by these two men than by any other cause except the Second World War itself, and Mao's famine alone likely killed more people than the entire European theater of the Second World War. The empty fields of Russia, the empty cities of Ukraine, the empty countryside of China, the silence where 100 million people should have been. That is the legacy of the two men at the top of this list. Not ideology, not revolution, not the workers' paradise. The silence? Add them up. Take all 15 men on this list. Take the low-end estimates, the most conservative scholarly figures, the ones least likely to be inflated by political motivation or methodological error. Add them together. The number you get is somewhere above 160 million people. Now take the high-end estimates. The number approaches 250 million. 250 million human beings. Dead. Not from war, in the sense of two roughly equal forces meeting on a field. Not from plague, not from famine, in the way famine was once understood as the indifferent consequence of drought or crop failure. Dead because 15 men made decisions. Dead because 15 men had power over the food supply, the military, the secret police, the definition of who was a citizen and who was an enemy. Dead because 15 men believed with absolute, unwavering, unjustifiable conviction that they were right. What do we do with this? The wrong answer is to treat these 15 as aberrations, as monsters from outside the human species, creatures so far outside the normal distribution of human behavior that they provide no useful information about what human beings are capable of. This answer is wrong, not because it is unsympathetic, but because it is dangerous. Because if these 15 men were simply monsters, aliens wearing human suits, then there is nothing to learn from them. There is nothing to guard against. There is no early warning system to build. The right answer is harder. The right answer requires us to acknowledge that every single one of these 15 men was recognized, at some point in their careers, by significant numbers of their contemporaries as a visionary, a hero, a savior, a great leader. Stalin was mourned with genuine mass grief by millions of Soviet citizens when he died. Mao's China built a cult of personality that millions of Chinese people internalized as genuine love. Leopold II was praised in the European press as a Christian philanthropist for years, while his agents were cutting off children's hands in the Congo. Tamerlane was celebrated in his own time as a restorer of Islamic civilization. This is not because human beings are stupid. It is because power has a gravitational field. It distorts perception. It selectively rewards those who affirm it and destroys those who challenge it, and the distortion is not always visible from inside. The most dangerous tyrannies in history were the ones that felt, to those living inside them, like salvation. There are structural lessons embedded in this list. Every single one of the 15 men on it operated without meaningful institutional checks on their power. Every single one of them had eliminated, captured, or terrified into silence the institutions, courts, press, parliament, opposition parties, independent military command that might have constrained them. The historian of this period is not looking at a random sample of bad luck. She is looking at a recurring pattern: concentration of power, elimination of accountability, catastrophic consequences. The corollary is uncomfortable but important. The institutions that prevent tyranny are not exciting. They are slow, frustrating, compromising, bureaucratic, and often deeply imperfect. Courts that acquit the guilty, parliaments that fail to act, a free press that prints things we hate. These imperfections are not bugs in the system, they are features. They are the friction that makes absolute power impossible. And the men on this list, almost without exception, were geniuses at convincing the people around them that the friction was the enemy. Centuries have passed since Tamerlane built his towers of skulls in Baghdad. Decades have passed since Mao's Great Famine. The fields of Cambodia grow green over the mass graves of the killing fields. In Phnom Penh, you can visit S21, the torture center, which is now a museum. In Ukraine, the Holodomor is taught in schools. In Germany, the Holocaust is enshrined in law as the defining moral catastrophe of the nation's history, the thing against which all subsequent politics is measured. And yet, the patterns recur. The rhetoric of existential threat, the identification of internal enemies, the promise of a pure and perfect future that justifies any sacrifice in the present. These patterns have not disappeared from human political life. They have adapted. They have found new vocabularies, new platforms, new populations to inhabit. The names on this list are not lessons from a finished past. They are warnings about a present that has not yet decided what it will be. 160 million people who would not be dead if 15 men had been stopped in time. The question history is asking the question it has been asking for 3,000 years, from Nero's burning Rome to Mao's silent countryside, is whether we are paying attention. The answer, so far, is mixed. The bones are still counting on us to do better.